Hello, everyone. Today we have an incredibly special guest with us, Christopher Owens, who is joining us from Dallas, Texas. Christopher is not only the Executive Strategy Director at TRG, one of the top independent agencies in the United States, but also the co-founder of educational platform called brandLingual. With multiple Cannes Lions and Effie Awards attached to his name and work, he is also a deeply dedicated mentor and educator who has taught strategy at Miami Ad School's Strategy Bootcamp around the world for more than 2 decades. And in 2025, he was also named AAF Educator of the Year, a well-deserved recognition of his contribution to the next generation of strategists. So guys, let's all give Christopher a very warm welcome to the Strategy Pints event. Welcome.
Thank you, Baiba, and it's fun to continue the tradition again. But yeah, this next hour is with me and with all of you, and I've been given a thorny topic to tackle, although it's not the first time. So I've put a brave face on, brought my crystal ball, and yeah, we'll be talking a bit about the future. But what's really interesting about all of this is I think it's very special in the sense that this is not my first Strategy Pints, and every single time I come back and do something, it always forces me to dig into a topic that I have a great deal of interest in or passion in, or forces me learn or to unlearn something. And so if we go back to 2023, which was the first time I visited Strategy Pints in Berlin, I gave a talk on the 10 things teaching has taught me about strategy. Back to Baiba's very kind intro, I have been teaching strategy for a long time. And to me, teaching strategy is like dancing about dancing. The two things are so intertwined. Guiding a room full of potential people who are looking to solve a problem together or wanting to know more in order to solve that problem, to accomplish that outcome, they need some kind of knowledge or information going in. And thus, that sounds like a team as much as it sounds like a team of learners or a team of students. So this idea of teaching strategy is sort of like, again, it's like dancing about dancing. I have a hard time separating the two in my head. And so that was a talk I gave back in 2023. That was probably the closest thing to my heart over many years. And then in 2024, it was actually Raj, a Strategy Pints member in Berlin, who wanted to talk more about this particular topic. And this got assigned to me back then. And so I brought in some thought starters back in 2024. I'm going to be revisiting some of these because how often do you get to go back and kind of check your own work and say, okay, well, these are things I predicted or thought about in 2024. Have they come to be in 2026? But then last year, on the 3rd-year anniversary of Strategy Pints, or at least close to it, I came in with another topic, which to me very much overlaps with a lot of, my thinking, and I'm certainly not the only one talking or thinking about any of these things, about what the future of strategy looks like. And almost like it was a version of this, but it was specifically tied around this concept of what I like to refer to as a full stack strategist, sometimes referred to as a total strategist or integrated strategist. There's been lots of different terms thrown around on this concept. And each year in WARC's Future of Strategy, they actually find a different term for it. But that was a talk I gave back in 2025 for those of you who attended the live event in Pankau, where Baiba also spoke, as well as Yuri Baruchin. And so the big question then became, what if I was to do some type of talk in 2026? What might it be? Unfortunately, I'm not in Berlin in person, is when I usually do this, but I will be in person the first week of July. So look for a live community Strategy Pints event on July 9th. It'll just be like a casual get together. The topic then became, well, if I can't make it in person, and since we've now brandLingual Strategy Pints have sort of merged, is there an opportunity to have me come speak again? And what would it be? A former student, Alethea, actually in the WhatsApp chat had talked about, well, let's talk about future strategy. And once again, I get to pin the tail on the donkey with that particular topic. So really, it's kind of a back to the future, and that I'm going to be rehashing this subject, but I'm going to be adding to it. I put out on the WhatsApp the fact that this is a new topic that I'm tackling and something that I think all of us think about every day. Think about it quite a bit. Here at TRG, I co-lead a group of 50 different strategists across brand strategy, comm strategy, and investment strategy. And so it is in our livelihood to always be set up for what comes next. And this is a topic that obviously anyone, agency side, client side, whatever, interacting with agencies that are delivering strategy capabilities back, it's like it's cliche or an understatement to say that people aren't thinking about this. And so it's obviously something I've been thinking about, but I was actually more interested in what have you been thinking about? And it was, to be honest, quite an outpouring of both highs and lows. It put some energy into the thread, and to be honest, some of the things were heartbreaking, and there was some emotion, and I think there is a lot of just cautious optimism, if not maybe just people dealing with their realities. And I've taken a lot of that to heart, and it's helped me kind of shape essentially what are kind of 5 things that I see moving ahead. In the end, you're going to see 10 things because I want to go back and look at those 5 things back from 2024 just to kind of grade my own homework to see how I did. But then I want to build on top of those things and realize that a lot of the things that you're offering up in the WhatsApp thread in the community were very close to some topics I've been thinking and working and developing against for some time now. So here I am back with the crystal ball, but this isn't the first time. So if I go back to 2024, when Raj asked me to do this talk, I started with this idea of like, well, what happens if? And 2023 into 2024, what happens if AI tools actually become our teammates, our little cognitive assistants, or our little cogs that are following us around invisibly like an entourage, helping us answer questions, take care of convenient work, maybe even someday agentically help us take some of the menial tasks out of our day-to-day so we can spend more time thinking and collaborating and actually having great conversations with our clients and our colleagues as opposed to constantly hiding behind glass and slides. What if audiences become animals? And this is probably more of a far-fetched one, but it was inspired by another strategy pinter from years back who gave a talk about in the future, is it possible with AI and machine learning that we will actually be able to crack the code of animal languages and thus be able to actually communicate with some animals? And might animals, perhaps even alongside their human parents, now become part of an addressable audience? At what point will we have a total addressable audience that might relevantly include animals, our fur babies? Jacques Patiza, who is a strategy partner at Publicis Lux that handles all the LVMH business from a comm strategy, media strategy side, is a frequent guest speaker in the boot camp with the Miami Ad School that I teach. And she actually showed a case that was done, I want to say in Croatia, with a fairly well-known pet product manufacturer who had found some out-of-home digital technology where they had digital out-of-home boards that had a camera. And as you walked by with your dog, it would size you up as well as the type of dog that you had. And then based on the breed of the dog and you would actually serve a message back to you that was relevant to your dog and relevant more to you as the pet parent. But interesting innovation, or at least a stunt trying to deal with some form of personalization at some limited scale, but it's a digital out-of-home thing. So that's one thing that I've seen. But I wouldn't check that box to say that that's something that we're really dealing with right now today. I think it's still highly experimental. Our industry doesn't really want to know how advertising works. Boom. I think this is still a big green check. I really feel that there's a lot of willful ignorance that's being practiced both within our industry, but also on client side, and in some cases, no fault of their own. I agree and take the side of Team Ritson on the idea that we are an unprofessional profession and that you don't need a license or a certificate or any kind of training to get into marketing. You can roll out of bed and open up a website and get something notarized, at least in the US, and you can be in the advertising marketing world. And so it doesn't mean that we don't feel our own responsibility to actually bring well-suited strategies and efficacious advice to our clients. There's a lot of malpractice that still exists. And I still run into this every day. This was a big part of when Bob and I launched brandLingual. It was a big part of the inspiration behind that, but certainly something that we've all been challenged with and dealing with, whether through our teaching careers or perhaps even more practically with our paying clients on a daily basis. And hearing the things that they're wanting to accomplish, listening to how they think they can be accomplished and not being able to connect the dots. Again, I still feel like the question that no one ever likes to ask each other, or much less their client, is how do you think advertising works? And yet you can have a team of 50 or 100 people all trying to make advertising work, but because they never had the conversation, because they never asked the question, because they never opened up with each other about it, they're all taking the same dollar of the budget and they're running off in 100 different directions. And just that lack of shared fluency and that lack of alignment often leads to just a great deal of malpractice and waste that exists. So that's one that I still feel is it wasn't really a prediction. It was more of just a fact. And that fact still exists. What happens if we start billing for outcomes instead of hours? There's a stat it's a combination of Michael Farmer worked with a colleague, but essentially about half of agencies have now moved away from hourly billing rates and moving to value-based outcomes or outcome-based compensation structures. So at a time when we're dealing with AI in our practice, and now how do you charge for a couple of seconds or a couple of nanoseconds? You charge for minute increments, hour-long increments. That old model of how advertising is getting paid for has definitely been challenged over the past decade, but that has quickened with the advent of all sorts of AI layers coming into our tech stacks. It's a key point of concern and consternation and clear transparency needs in terms of contract obligations and things with scopes of work. And so we are in a point right now where I believe it's starting to shift. It's still probably balanced about 50-50. I think things are tilting into a more of an outcome-based model, and I think that's a good thing for our industry. And then last but not least, are we expected all to simply become more full stack strategists? And this was a prediction I made in 2024. It's a presentation I gave in 2025, both at Strategy Pints in Berlin, but then also at Stratfest up in New York. That last piece is still something very close to my heart, and it's something that is, to me, going to be a segue into the 5 new predictions that I have here for 2026 that, again, were crowdsourced and inspired by a lot of your wonderful thoughts that you provided in the WhatsApp thread. Looking back, it felt like I was kind of cheating in some cases because some of those things were things that were happening. So were they things happening in the future? If anything, some of these things have accelerated. It's the audiences becoming animals that I think was still probably a little early. It's still a little early on that one. So maybe that's a 2028, 2030 situation. But what I'd love to focus on now is let's get to present tense. Let's get away from the 2024 crystal ball. Let's repolish it and let's look ahead. I do want to touch on that last one that you see up there. What if we're all expected to be much more multidisciplinarians and co-disciplinarians when it comes to our concept of being a strategist and practicing strategy? Are the days of simply getting really good at finding an insight or being able to craft a great creative brief and just doing that for years and decades and getting older and getting more responsibility around just those tasks and assuming that we're going to then get paid more money for that, is that still a viable career path? I don't think that's been really a viable, sustainable career path for some time. And observe it in my own career and choices that I've made or mistakes that I've made or regrets that I might even have, but just being very, very present and active in the strategy planet for a couple of decades. This to me is one of these inevitable things whose time has come. And so this is where I'm going to pick up on a topic, and I'm not going to deep dive on it as I've done in the past, but I think it's very much a foundation of where I'm continue to look at moving ahead. So if we skip past those other 2024 predictions and get back to how I talked about it in 2024 and do a brief revisit of 2025, what I'm talking about here is, again, layering our practice. Each one of these things that exists on the left-hand side of that Moleskine page is essentially a task, right? Creative strategy is essentially a task. Brand strategy is a task. Comm strategy is a task. Some form of data or foresight or future strategy tasks, and there could be even a longer list. Not only are they tasks, but many consider them competencies, not just competencies, functions, departments, disciplines, roles, even job descriptions. And so part of what has made strategy soup a bit of an alphabetical nightmare for particularly a lot of early career strategists is just being able to reconcile when is it a task, when it is a model, when is it a framework, when is it a job description, When is it a title? When is it at what? And so our industry, for as much as we love to talk about clarity and simplicity and conciseness and strong brand architecture and the importance of strong branding, we have often been the dentist with bad teeth. We practice within our own discipline in a quite confusing way, and oftentimes can bow so heavily to the throne of differentiation that we look to try and call the same thing a million different things. I happen to like this idea of just trying to find a more winning position for the future and whatever the endeavor might be, but knowing that there's always a means to an end. The choices that you have in front of you can oftentimes feel infinite, but yet, unfortunately, we have a finite budget and finite amount of time to help make some of those more positive future realities come to life. So then where are you going to play and how are you going to win, right? To borrow from Roger Martin. So have not been one of those strategists that wants to create their own definition for it. I'm happy with the smoothie blender of pulling together that intention of just trying to find a winning position for the future, but reconcile that on the left-hand side, there's more than just creative strategy, more than just brand comms and data strategy. There's the dark arts. It is the soft skills that are sometimes the hardest skills. That's the political wranglings, and just trying to keep a small group of humans aligned in one room can often be a bit like herding cats. And so it really does take over time, I think, a very multifaceted kind of person to last this long in this industry, and over time find new ways to break muscle memory. And if you're going to be doing strategy for 20 years, the thing that should haunt you the most is make certain it's not just 2 years repeated 10 times or 5 years repeated 4 times. Look to stretch and look to grow, because it takes a very large surface area and understanding of all these things that need to be orchestrated at this point in time. And I'd say for a very, very long time, it's taken lots of different things that have to be orchestrated together in order to accomplish brand growth. It's never been, as romantically as some of us would like to believe, just some genius insight in a creative brief or just some amazing founder product idea that has sailed 1,000 ships. It's always been a very, very, very unique combination of things that then come to bear, oftentimes with a great deal of luck playing with probability. I'm also one of those people that I do not want to dip into nihilism, but when you do start to look in a lot of the evidence, you sometimes wonder that perhaps there's a lot of wonderfully successful brand growth stories that essentially was the surfer trying to get too much of the credit when really you should blame the wave. If you look back at what often can be the physics or gravity that helps you grow, is, are you in a growing category to begin with? And too often, we are the same humans that, not that long ago, let's go back thousands of years, we would throw family members into a volcano. When we wanted it to rain, we would do a certain kind of dance. And if it didn't rain the right way, we would kick our knees higher or question whether or not we had enough people dancing all at the same time. And so these same delusions that we are actually open to as humans continue to exist inside of this meat machine, inside of the same hardware and software that really has not evolved that much. And so it is unchanged man, despite all the pornography of change that sometimes our industry can get over fascinated with. It is the unchanged man that still helps us realize that we can be quite fallible. So when there are all sorts of different conditions at play, and when you do finally exhale and give in to the fact that so much of what we're doing is based on probability, not determinism, it does help you really appreciate just how much has to be orchestrated all at once, and how could it have ever been that one beautifully articulated, sing-songy, you're not you when you're hungry kind of insight creative thing, is that the only thing that really brought the success to that brand? No, it's always been far more complicated. And in the absence of understanding and over time really working to learn and unlearn and making certain that you're layering in as many side skills and side quests and upscaling as best you can to better understand all the different facets of strategy, that's kind of on us individually. In the absence of that, you can focus on things that oftentimes simply just don't matter, or don't matter as much as you'd like them to matter. And you miss a lot of core fundamentals, and you end up with a reality of something like this. You end up with an industry, And this is starting to suggest that what we're talking about is just a 1P affair, that advertising or marketing communications is the waste, when in fact we have to remember that there are 4Ps that can be orchestrated, and sure, some might say 5, 6, or 7. But just to pick on this 1P, because oftentimes I feel like it is the one that swims around us the most often and is perhaps the one that adds to so much of the waste. It's exactly what it is we constantly on a daily basis have an industrial scale just creating an absolute mountain of just kind of wasteful ad-like objects. It's the great work of Kate Newstead alongside Jenny Romaniuk and others at Ehrenberg-Bass that a number of years ago did a piece of research that helped us come to this conclusion that 84% of comms out there in the world is simply not memorable enough to matter. It's either forgotten, instantly forgotten after it's viewed, or it's incorrectly attributed back to the brand, leaving only about 16% of work that is actually meeting that threshold to actually have a chance of making a memory, and then in fact perhaps increasing the odds in the future that someone will actually even consider that brand. So the lack of memorability that exists out there is often put back on the fact that when all you've focused on is, I need to persuade someone, my better customer, and this is this message that has to do that, have you simply missed the opportunity to fall back on the fundamentals and realize we're still in the memory refreshment business, we're in the memory making business. But oftentimes the work that is allegedly moving those metrics on the dashboard is happening in only digital media, of which there's 6 of 7 digital media impressions don't pass the attention memory threshold to actually even potentially form a memory. Karen Nelson Field with that 2.5-second threshold. So much of the work that happens in digital media falls beneath the 1-second threshold. And so there's lots of money being wasted on ad units that simply never stood a chance. Yes, they were served, but the real question is, have they been seen? It's being dispersed in between lots of tech companies who are simply taking advantage of the fact that most clients don't want to know where the money is going or how it's being spent, unfortunately. And to quote Bob Hoffman in a LinkedIn thread I saw the other day, it's like, why are ad tech companies making so much more money than advertising agencies? It's because they simply are better liars. So there's a hot take. Check out the work of Dr. Augustine Fu if you want to dig into this, or the work of Nico Neumann, or a colleague down in Austin, Samin Amadi Cohen at the agency Idea Peddler, who has a great presentation called the Attribution Illusion, which I can provide a link to if you really want to get into that. It's a very dark space, dark dystopian world. A lot of these things can borderline get on nihilism, but I hope to kind of lift you up with some hopeful thoughts here by the end. And last but not least, it's the work of Eat Big Fish, Adam Morgan, alongside Peter Field and others, using different kinds of data sets to remind us that, again, if we're in the memory making business and you haven't elicited some type of surprise or conjured up some kind of emotion that gets our forecasting predictive brain to suddenly break with what the model is, which might even open an opportunity for the work to even be measured or remembered. Yes, too much of the work out there is simply dull. If I had to quote System 1 and B2C work, that's about 50% of work does not go beyond the neutral threshold. So in other words, it rarely has a chance to actually even form a memory because there is no emotion triggered that even gets our brain to pay attention to anything. And if you look in B2B, that's actually up around 80%. Because in B2B, someone has convinced them that in fact it's a different kind of human and it's a different type of way to communicate. And it always has to be very, very, very rational, when there's a great amount of evidence that suggests, in fact, that's never been the case and shouldn't be the case, that in fact, a lot of B2B decisions, in fact, have even more emotion freighted upon them, because it is often a small group of people making a decision for a larger organization, and for them to make the wrong organization their own professional, they feel like they're put in some kind of professional peril, and their own job might be, or livelihood, be put into question. And so in fact, there's even more emotion riding on this. But yes, I think a lot of the pathology goes back to that our industry as practitioners, whether we're client side or agency side, we have been practicing in the dark ages for way, way, way too long. And we're in a golden age right now of better understanding of that, better than we ever have. And at what point we don't want to learn those things, are unaware of them, or know them, and then knowingly do something in the opposite direction is, again, practicing some kind of willful ignorance. But I would be one of the first people to say that for at least 20 years of my career, A big part of a lot of the work when I go back and be very honest about why it didn't work, it's because it never stood a chance. And that's something that I'm willing to admit. I think as we get more mature and senior in our practice, learning and being open about what we don't know should be the new level of seniority. It should not be this performative mastery of that I know everything and I've always known everything. The new level of being a senior mature practitioner should be the willingness to like be the etch-a-sketch and shake yourself every once in a while and redraw some new map of understanding about what it is that we're doing on an everyday basis. But yet, if I were to be asked, well, how to grow a brand, for most of my career, how much time do you have? I'd quote some Wittgenstein. Maybe I'd get out a geometric shape. I'd want to draw an easel. I'd want to go on for 20 minutes with like a 50-page deck, whatever. Like, it's wild. And I've posed this question to audiences around the world. And whenever I ask, hey, if someone were to catch on fire, everybody in sometimes different languages comes back with some kind of like boom, boom, boom. But if I would ask this question of a group of marketers or strategists, like I did up in Stratfest or in Berlin or other places, there's a hushed silence just like now. And if we admit to it in the past, I probably would have said, well, okay, well, it's first of all, I have to go find some very, very unique customer segment that has some very special DNA spiral, and I can own this customer. I just need to make certain that my brand DNA uniquely connects to their brand DNA and we share in values, because in the end, if I can just make more of them loyal and love this brand, that's going to be the main thing that's going to drive growth. And what's wonderful about loyalty is it's a small group of people, and that means my media is going to be much more efficient and I don't have to spend as much, because who could afford broad reach? And brand love is the ultimate path to profit. In fact, only 20% of my customers is who I need to focus on because they bring 80% of sales. And I heard it repeated enough that it stuck, because it's way more expensive, maybe 5, 6x more expensive to acquire a new customer than to keep a current customer happy, etc. Like, this was part of my mental iTunes playlist when I was working with clients or in meetings. And these were things that I picked up as if by random or through osmosis in my own upbringing. These are things that I've taught to students over many years. But to be frank, a lot of this is nonsense. A lot of the things that you see on the slide have never been true. There's been some truthiness about them. Have enough people repeat the same thing enough times? And again, this gets back to the condition that we're in. But at what point you become aware that the evidence beneath these statements in yellow, in fact, were never good to begin with. And worse, were you a critical enough thinker or were in a brave space or a safe space or psychologically safe within the culture of your agency or your client or brand marketer to actually ever question these things? Were you ever given the space to say, is that really true? Or to question why these things might be the current operating system? At what point you start to open up and investigate, you start to question all sorts of things. And being a really wonderful critical thinker and making certain critical thinking is always in your practice is something that, to be honest, I did not have in my own practice soon enough. But when I talk about this sort of golden age, there is a kind of unifying theory. It is definitely not unified. And for every logo I put on the slide that's emerging in this enlightenment, they will even agree to disagree, oftentimes quite loudly, about there not being anything unified about it. There is quite a bit of replication crisis that a lot of these theories are passing through, with different organizations attempting to take some of these laws and levers and play them out and see them in different data sets. And there is some painful agreement and oftentimes even fun disagreement that happens between these institutions and the practitioners within them and even beyond. This slide can actually be quite cluttered nowadays. There's even more brands and institutions and agencies and client marketers that are contributing to all of this. And so this is a really interesting, exciting time. It's often has been motivated by looking at these same things and looking back in that same crystal ball and saying, okay, where are we headed? I thought we might play a little game. I often play this on Slido. And as I went to go casually load up Slido to give you a QR code to make this easy for us to play digitally, Slido reminded me that it also loves to make money. And that survey that I had readily available was not going to be able to be relaunched without me committing some other kind of contractual obligation. So I said, you know what? All right, Slido wins, I lose, but we can still play this game. And so we can do this either by blurting things out or dropping in the chat. But I'd love to play this game by using the great Paul Dyson. He's an econometrician at Accelero. He did a piece of work that has often been quoted by a number of different luminaries. He did with Think Tank as well as Kantar, a study that he did over 4 different times, 3 or 4 different times, pre-pandemic, during pandemic, post-pandemic. And he asked marketers, practitioners to rank these 10 things as to which of these 10 things are those things that are the key drivers of advertising profitability, so that when you lean into and commit time and resources to getting these things right, do they actually contribute to a more profitable commercial outcome as with regards to marketing communication? From target segmentation to having the proper multimedia mix to ratio of brand performance, creative quality, brand size, lay down flighting, budget setting across portfolios. Even if some of these topics or terms or phrases are not familiar to you, the point of this is it's not an exam, but if you had to just guess what you think the top 3 are, I'm curious where you might end up. So feel free to drop those in the chat. This is where Slido is much more helpful because it's anonymous. Devesh says creative quality as number 1. Anybody else brave enough to drop in anything you think that's in the top 3 coming with brand size? Ratio? Yeah, Yelena with brand size. I know we got a couple of ringers in the audience here that I know have done their homework. Brand size, creative quality, ratio, okay? It's also the crafty use of AI that can be done. What's fascinating about this, you're already doing much better than most marketers. Again, like 700 global marketers were asked this question over a period of studies. The most recent one, results coming back in 2023. And when they were asked, this is consistently over each wave where they thought the priority should be: number 1, multimedia mix; number 2, ratio to branded performance; number 3, target segmentation. So target segmentation coming up there in the top 3, then creative quality, and then brand size, and then the rest start to trickle down. And what was so fascinating is that this stayed very consistent over those periods of time. Paul Dyson had access to thousands of different cases, metrics mostly provided as a part of the ThinkBox and sort of Kantar sponsorship of this particular piece of research. But he was allowed to run this through an econometric model and essentially say that when you look back at some of the most successful campaigns, the profitability drivers and the multipliers are certainly not all created equal. I think what's most interesting about this slide is just how upside down it is versus how a lot of people might intuitively think where their decision-making power should lie. And so that being said, brand size. So if for no other function, then it's the law of double jeopardy showing back up. But unfortunately, there's no button we can push to make a brand the biggest brand overnight. But underneath that stack is creative quality, coming in at a 12x. And then everything beneath that is some form of comms or media decision-making, which is really, really quite significant when you pull all those things together in combination. The reason why I bring all of this up is because it's being exposed to a piece of information like this that really helps you understand just how multifaceted work has to be and how much orchestration has to go on to accomplish those large commercial effects that our clients are always looking for. That brand size is not something we can make happen overnight. It, in fact, is the one law that's sitting up there, and everything else is acting a bit more like a lever. But if orchestrated in the right way with the right priority order and emphasis, might there be another way to look at this chart to see a way by which to then decode what is necessary to actually accomplish brand size? So much of us, our backgrounds are brand and creative strategy, whether we're client side or agency side. That's often where a lot of our time goes. And yes, creative quality and target segmentation are often kind of key asks or remits as a part of those particular disciplines. And then you get into all forms of media, comms, connections, performance, and data. So you end up with essentially a set of responsibilities that, if prioritized, are rarely ever orchestrated by one person, but are orchestrated by a team. Effectiveness is very much a team sport. But you, as a strategist who has an understanding of how all these things connect and can actually make present that all of these things, in fact, are being prioritized and orchestrated in the right way, can be one of your key value adds to really any kind of a situation that you might find yourself in. Again, whether you're agency side or client side. I mean, strategists simply need more shared fluency about how all these things come together. And if all you've ever worried about is insight, if all you've ever worried about is a proposition in a quote unquote creative brief, and that's all you've ever worried about, then you have been living a career with just some really, really limiting blinders on. And although the language might sound foreign, it's being able to interoperate between these different stacks that is really where true strategy at scale actually works. So since everything is more interconnected, our knowledge should be just as interconnected as well. To accomplish this thing at the top of brand size, it does not happen overnight. And for most brands, it never happens. They never become the biggest brand, right? And maybe that's not even the goal, right? But to grow over time, to at least go from small to medium to less medium, to aspire over time, there's all sorts of conditions that need to be present to do that. And again, this is a clue that in fact, that one thing at the top is not standing up there at the top by itself. It in fact is standing up there at the top based on stacks and stacks of lots of other decisions. When not well orchestrated, will never allow you to accomplish that thing at the top, right? So that thing will fall off the top if you're not actually balancing everything. Do you really want to be that strategist for your entire career? Do you want to be the strategist who only focuses on just one of these things? When in fact, if you're going to be growing and becoming more sustainably, professionally relevant, despite AI intrusion, can you be the one who actually comes in with a lens and a fundamental understanding about how to interpret and orchestrate what, for at least the next 3 to 5 years, will be mostly human-driven decisions, agentically assisted? But can you be the person who better understands the surface area enough to actually help orchestrate and pull these things together across teams, across your own practice? So really, it is a desire to then encourage more and more strategists earlier in their career. You have to come in and declare a major. You want to be a brand strategist. You want to be a creative strategist. You want to be a media or comm strategist. Great. Commit to that for your first 0 to 3 years. But if that's all you then do, and now you're 9 years in, and it's 3 years repeated 3 times, you've really missed the bigger picture, which is then finding ways to become more fluent, multidisciplinary, and understanding these other different dialects and pulling these all together in your practice. There's lots of different shapes that have been described as being different types of professionals or practitioners over the years. For every shape you could find, there's the X-crossed employee, there's the I-shaped person, there's the pie-shaped, there's the key-shaped employee. And the idea of being key-shaped, I think, is a very, very wonderfully healthy place to be. Is you declared your major, and maybe it was brand creative strategy many years ago. Great, you've really, really developed that prong. But then have a minor, declare a double minor. Those minors become majors. Try to bring as much key prongs as much as you possibly can into your key-shaped identity so that you are becoming way more fluent about how all these things come together. Clients will value you more because you can actually speak their language. You can actually better understand how these things connect. Other practitioners in the agency will respect you more. You will actually find more respect and shared fluency by being in the room when you're not only ever just talking about your thing. When really a lot of the great work today happens in a much more nonlinear way. So the idea of this whole thing was really to suggest that if you can aspire to be over time more of a full stack strategist and take each of those strategy stacks into your own practice and learning, that is a way for you to become more future proof. And that often is, I think, the elephant in the room whenever anyone asks the question, what is the future of strategy? It's actually just another way of saying, hey, Christopher, am I going to have a job in 2 or 3 years? Or how can I get a job right now? Oftentimes the question, what is the future of strategy, is simply a proxy for that question. And so I meet the answer with what I think is a great prescription for, yes, becoming not only more relevant and impactful in the actual work, but also extending your runway and becoming more professionally adaptive in all the different circumstances you might find yourself in. Go find the interpreter at the UN or at the G8 or wherever that speaks 2, 3, 4 languages, and they're booking all day long, right? That's a great place to be because people will still want the human companion in the loop for a lot of those oftentimes very nuanced and personal conversations. So just like in strategy, don't be the strategist that just speaks one language. Recognize that there's a wealth of dialects that are all interoperate out in this sort of like diaspora of strategy. And the Tower of Babel has fallen long ago, and it's spread itself into many different charts appreciate them all and bring them all into your practice and find how they all interconnect. The interconnectedness between them often is uncanny, and sometimes the words shift and change, but they all need each other in order to accomplish those big commercial outcomes our clients are working for. It's not just about having the perfect insight framework, right? It's about how all these things connect and interconnect together. Okay, so really everything that I'm now talking about moving into the future, and we'll transition to more of some conversation because a lot of you filled in and helped me fill in some of these gaps, is if that's the best advice Uncle Christopher could give you, if part of the proxy of the question is how do I stay relevant as a strategist by asking what is the future of strategy, it's be multilingual, be multidisciplinary, be the generalist. Take pride in being a generalist. Realize that when you start, you might start as a specialist, but don't let that be your destiny. Start as a specialist, focus on a thing, but then over time, try and declare as many minors to double majors as you possibly can. And again, I'm speaking metaphorically here, so that you become much more of a full stack strategist. Because if you do, perhaps you might be better prepared for what happens next in 2026 and beyond when we look into the crystal ball. And if I had to add 5 more things, it might be such things as then what happens if AI raises the floor, but really this fluency and shared fluency about real buyers buy, how markets actually move or often don't move, fluency and understanding of those things really raises the ceiling. And as you bring more AI into your practice, you can actually do so willingly, but also using it in the right way. What happens if strategy has to become fluent, not only downstream, where too often we like to play when we're just part of a 1P marketing organization or a strategist working for a 1P marketing driven brand, but we actually find more, defy gravity and go upstream and climb up the ladder and get more into the conversations about how the other 3 Ps are being shaped. The 4th P, often referred to as promotion, is only an amplifier of the quality of the other 3 Ps, product, price, and place. So when product, price, and place are not optimized, oftentimes the amplification of the 4th P can do more harm than good, can actually drive more stress on the system or drive more attention to what's not working potentially. Thus, making certain that we can be as strategically fluent and helpful with product, price, and place, and understanding the orchestration of those things is paramount. And when that is working well enough, then the 4th P actually really becomes useful. But when all the distraction is only ever on that 1 P of promotion and the other 3 are just running around like chickens with their head cut off, that's a mess. So we need to be fluent there, more upstream. The demand for good strategy problem, I believe, is also a language problem. Now, this is where my own confirmation bias might come in, and I have to check myself. Again, I like to practice critical thinking on my own thoughts, and there could be some motivated reasoning here that every time I see a nail, I'm a hammer, just like every time I look at the problems I see in our industry, I see them as language problems. Part of why brandLingual happened, it's because of this repetitive observation I continue to make, that Bob and I make across so many of our interactions, that the best strategists will be multilingual between competing schools of thought. You could call them 2 schools of thought, which again is what inspired bilingual to brandlingual. But in fact, as we further explore, we find that there's even more dialects. There's different ways to talk about these different schools, even on that. And then the last thought was then that the strategist of 2030 looks less like a department and probably more like a connective tissue. But they're the 5 things often inspired by a lot of the work or replies that you put very passionately and in very sort of heartfelt ways in the WhatsApp thread. If I had to double click onto some of these, and for each one of these, then I want to open up a bit of discussion. When I say AI raises the floor, yes, but perhaps real, true understanding, that kind of fluency actually raises the ceiling. Just knowing something instantly because AI told you, as opposed to having a real understanding of how that works. AI is about to make seemingly competent strategy, I think, dangerously abundant. And we're not talking about brilliant, game-changing strategy of sometimes we like to romanticize or not commercially transformative strategy, but or maybe not even like deeply human strategy, but good enough, right? Good enough. This conversation that continues to haunt so many of my private conversations, and I'm not going to put any names here, is when I'm speaking with someone and they say, yeah, we're just vibe coding that. Yeah, we just canceled that subscription. We're saving so much money, and we just vibe coded our ad tech solution. Cool. What's your human reference point? How are you going to like check in on humans quarterly? Because when the models shift, how can you trust that what you vibe coded in fact is still going to be? Oh, Christopher, listen, we've been letting just hardly trained 20 somethings for so long figure out these plans and advise our clients, and our clients have been buying the solutions. So if that's my bar, an untrained early career person, then of course I can vibe code something better than that. And plus, what I vibe coded doesn't want health insurance, right? And so it just comes in this death spiral of efficiency. So yeah, I mean, ripped from the headlines, but yeah, it's that kind of strategy is dangerously abundant nowadays. Everybody feels like they can vibe code the vibe code. And that really changes the game, because for years, strategy's value pretty much came from access to frameworks and models and research summaries and market analyses and lots of deck making, but maybe deep synthesis. But AI compresses so much of that just into nanoseconds that we can't bill for on a timesheet anymore, which means the floor rises dramatically, but the ceiling does not rise automatically when the floor rises, right? Because the real strategic advantage has been and always will be never the ability just to produce words. It was the ability to interpret what actually matters, diagnosis, what conflicts, what's missing, what's being mistaken for truth, what actually deserves real human action, the time to be spent. AI can generate very plausible language, sort of like strategy cosplay. It cannot yet reliably distinguish between a useful idea and perhaps just some kind of seductive average. I mean, and that's where fluency really, really matters. And not just fluency in culture and pop culture and dancing inside of a TikTok feed and talking about with a tiny mic about what just happened at the Met Gala, but it's real fluency in business and commercial outcomes, real fluency in corporate culture, real fluency in unchanged man, human behavior that for hundreds of thousands of years has been locked in and it's not going anywhere, despite what's dancing around on the surface, TikTok or something like this. Or fluency, yes, in local cultural nuance, but also fluency in what creative can and can't do. I still hear this myth that somehow you can out creative a small media spend, that somehow if you just paint some really cool flames on the side of that rocket and the goal is to get it to the moon, that the rocket doesn't really actually need any real fuel. No, it needs fuel. It needs actual spend behind it. It actually needs proper investment. Fluency in organizational realities. I had a wonderful conversation with a colleague, a brand marketer, that really, really talks about just the hardcore politics behind the scenes. The client does not want to hear the term mental availability. They will roll their eyes. It sounds like a made-up term. All they want to do is talk about awareness and consideration and the funnel. Great. It's like we can still talk about those things. We just have to find ways to translate and still understand that there's things that we can know about how markets actually move and how real buyers buy, and we can still bring that in. But those oftentimes are our colleagues and the practitioners around us and the C-level people we have to interact with. So perhaps the strategist of the future is not really the person who refuses AI, but it's the person who can hear where the machine sounds fluent, but really isn't. When it is just air guitar, when it is just the sort of convenient set of words that are sounding right in the moment, but actually are hollow calories. And so that I think is a great opportunity for all of us to get more fluent in the fundamentals. I'd love to hear from you. I'll be actually, I just kind of love to hear from you. And then if no one shares, I'll go ahead and share like the first time I ever got my face slapped where I feel like, oh my God, how did I not know this? And my whole professional career, life passed in front of my eyes when I started to realize that there's something that's been out there for 20 years in my career that I was not familiar with. And yet it single-handedly also explained so much of why certain projects I worked on where they never standed a chance. Would anyone else like to vulnerably share like a moment where you realize, oh wow, like had I only known that 3, 5, 10 years earlier? Anybody want to share?
This is Dinesh here. This happened quite a couple of years back when I just moved into agency circle after doing a business, I realized that people don't buy strategy the for the business outcomes. They buy more of on how the strategy makes them feel. Does it make them feel more confident in what we are doing, or does it makes them feel more sure of the job? It's not about if I can move the number needle. It is about how confident I can make them feel about their jobs. A brand manager feels, is he fulfilling his job? Or, a junior person, is he fulfilling his job to making his senior proud about him? It's how the strategy is sold. It's not sold on focusing on this is what will make your business grow. It's more on each and individual's KRA and KPIs in the chain of commands. And that's how I realized that that's completely different view of selling, because coming from business, I always cared about business. How will I grow my business? But that's not how it happens in an agency world also. Creative want strategy that will make them feel they can create a more fun or emotional ad. On a servicing guy would feel how close is this to the brief that a brand manager wrote to them. So everybody has to feel in, and the sales pitch has to cater to that kind of tone. That I realized, and that's why I realized that why my all strategies kept bombing regularly, because I kept on focusing on business, but others were differently.
So those tensions between the inside out needs of what the small group of humans in the room needs versus the outside in, what the market actually needs to move. And in fact, those could be completely at odds, right? And like feeling like you're stuck in between those two spaces. Yes. But yeah, so how so much of our work was about getting a room of 10, 15, 20 people, combined client agency side, to feel good about the work that we're doing together. And maybe less interested in how it might actually meet the market, and thus really focusing on magic sentences and colorful decks to give us confidence to do things that might not actually hold up when they hit the harsh reality of the market. But yet there's so much positive reinforcement and love bombing along the way, and pats on the back, and someone buys the next round of drinks, and smiley meetings and positive things, and like lots of just the right words floating in the air and just feeling good. And yet the market is unimpressed.
Yeah. So that was my slap on the face.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, Devesh. Yeah, I mean, I'll just to segue off of that, because it was pretty much like Devesh's story. Like, it was in 2017 when a blog post by Tom Roach hit me upside the head. He since republished it on his own blog in 2020. And yeah, the article was, and this is when he was at BBH in New York. And he's a strategist I've always respected. And I was reading his blog back then. And yeah, in 2017, most marketing is bad because it ignores the most basic data. I was like, okay, I typically pay attention to what Tom reads and what he puts out there and and then he showed this. And essentially, you can see what he says here. It's like 0 to 1. The greatest number of consumers of any brand are very light buyers, and they contribute significantly to sales volume. So for most brands, the biggest opportunity for growth comes from taking people from buying it 0 times to buying it once in a typical purchase cycle. So in other words, if we can move someone from none to one, that's often your biggest opportunity for growth. And essentially, as you dig into it, the big brands are the ones that are coming to mind more frequently for people going from none to one. I remember reading this and looking at this and like, I've never heard of this. This is ridiculous. This has got to be different for every category. It's got to be different for every brand. No client has ever shown me this. And I remember like, yeah, whatever, Tom, next. And then it haunted me. It really haunted me, this thing, because how could I be 20 years in my career and never see this chart? How could that be? And I'm the kind of person, when I have that stuck in my head, I'm like, okay, well, let's go find out where that is. And then that took me to a red book, and that took me to some guy named Ehrenberg. And I started reading more about it, and it became kind of masochistic, because so much of what I was reading was just slapping me upside the head. And then finally came upon the book, Eat Your Greens, or at least Weimer Snyder's. And this was then a couple years later. And then really started digging into this deep learning during the pandemic, as maybe some of us did. And so for those of you familiar with the banana chart, is how Weimer Snyder's talks about it. But yeah, it took me 20 years in my career to discover this thing called the negative binomial distribution Dirichlet, or the NBD. that essentially helps you understand that, in essence, if you are not focused on the deep, invisible, hidden lives of the light and frequent customer, and only ever focused on the fan truths of hardcore loyalists and people who love the brand, and you believe that they actually exist, A, and B, if they exist on the right-hand side of the chart under heavy category usage, people purchasing quite frequently in the market, oh, you're also wrong. And so like all of a sudden I started to realize that there is something that only metaphorically in a stationary market maps to the shape of what all human behavior looks like at scale when it's buying in any given category, whether it be drones or Velcro or B2B SaaS software or ballpoint pens or Zoom subscriptions. And so it took that slap upside the head in 2017 to begin a series of events which have brought me to the person or professional practitioner I am today. And because of the beauty of neuroplasticity, we can actually grow. We can continue to learn and unlearn. And despite the metabolic energy and great expense to unlearn, no pain, no gain. If you feel the unlearn burn, it can actually get you somewhere in your career. It's based on essentially an 80-year unbroken model. And people love to him and haw and to debate it and different reasons. And I think that's good. Again, peer review and skepticism, I think, should be our best friends, as opposed to just falling into some kind of like jingoistic cultic behavior. I think so much of what I've realized has come from really this one kind of confronting moment. And this is the same kind of knowledge that you need in just one small drip into a large lake of things that you can understand that will inoculate you against a lot of AI strategy cosplay and nonsense that might be coming at you from a vibe-coded deck. What happens if strategy has to become fluent upstream and downstream? I mean, one reason strategists feel increasingly powerless, and I think sometimes where the question comes as to like, what is the future of strategy, is because of this. I mean, we learned mostly communications. We learned about one of the P's, campaigns, messaging, positioning. We got obsessed about social behavior. We loved stories and we love getting to know people. And then we thought we found a career where we could do all those things and get paid for it. And then that's all we wanted to do is creative development. But growth rarely ever lives in 1P. I mean, real commercial movement happens upstream. Product decisions, pricing decisions, distribution decisions, portfolio decisions, operational decisions, customer experience decisions. And yes, also downstream, language, emotion, culture, memory, attention, meaning, behavior. But memory is shaped and formed by experiences far outside just communications. And it's all those things upstream that, in fact, often amount to, in orchestration, how everything plays at scale. So the future strategist has to move between both worlds without becoming trapped in either. Please don't just see a job in strategy as a means to subsidize your own curiosity. Again, you're playing with client money, and you're playing, even if you're a brand marketer on client side, it's like there are lots of livelihoods resting on this. And too many businesses make upstream decisions with no understanding of downstream human consequences and vice versa. And too many agencies create downstream ideas disconnected from any kind of upstream commercial reality, which goes right back to what Devesh was talking about, right? So it's not just asking, what should we say? But it's, what are we actually building? What behaviors are we enabling? What entry points are we satisficing? What frictions are we creating up and down across our different 4Ps of how we distribute it, price, the pricing at play, or the shelves that we're on or not on? What kind of future category reality are we actually shifting? Or is it in fact shifting us all of the time and we just don't want to admit to it? And the strategist's job is increasingly, I think, to translate, yes, human meaning into business decisions, but also business decisions back into the kinds of things that we can all talk about and align on and feel good about. What Devesh experienced is like half the puzzle, but at what point we can align and feel good around things that can actually move markets at scale, that's a really wonderful balance to be in. And so be the strategist that is the fulcrum between those two things. Don't over pivot so far that you are staring only at some kind of like ROAS or ROI expectation on the client side that is, again, masquerading as some type of like actual market level data when maybe it's just a vanity metric. Let's talk about, is this helping the brand acquire more new customers at scale? If brands aren't good at acquiring more new customers over time, this is what brings their decline. It's not just about retention. It's about, are you good at acquiring more new customers? So what are we doing today that actually helps you do that? And they're talking about something that not just one P can shape. Interesting, right? And then that might translate into being relevant in other ways. And again, making more adaptive and more versatile as a strategist with a capital S, and not just maybe little strategy, which might just be creative strategy, is important, but most important. And just like bitters is really important to a good old fashioned, you need the right balance of bourbon and everything else to that. Talk to a good barista about a great cup of coffee, and they'll talk to you as much about the water and the temperature and the beans and the sourcing and everything else. They won't just talk to you about the mug. And too often, strategists, we love to talk about the mugs. Or, you know what? They handle the water over here. I just handle the beans. A great cup of coffee is all these things coming together, and strategy is really no different in that regard. I mean, the future of strategy is not just a supply problem, it's also a demand problem. Do clients actually want it, right? I mean, a lot of strategists think the issue is that there's too much mediocre thinking in the market, too many decks, too much jargon, too much AI sludge dressed up as insight. Yeah, totally real. I got your back on that. But there's another problem underneath it. Like, many organizations no longer even possess a shared language for recognizing good strategy, right? So instead, they rely on all sorts of proxies, and confidence becomes strategy, the good vibes, the happy meetings that Devesh spoke of, the beautiful slides, the famous case studies, the AI generated fluency might even become strategy, because strategy is inherently difficult to evaluate. I mean, it's abstract. It is just as probabilistic as the probabilistic world that we're trying to make a difference in. It's often very future oriented, which is hard, right? It's hard to predict the future. So it's about planning for multiple scenarios. It's hard to isolate causality. It's really hard to do that. And even when you think you have, there are 3 other people that will come in and say, no, 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 no. And that's good. That's good when that happens. And it's also usually super, super opaque or invisible before actual implementation. I mean, so much of what we call good strategy is revisionist history. Right? It's after the work worked based on some conditions that weren't completely under our control that we come back and say, this is why this happened. And then that gets put in a case, and then that gets romanticized, and that gets put under a spotlight. And then we try to learn from that. So under pressure, organizations often reward what feels or sounds strategically reassuring rather than what is actually useful. And that really changes the role of the strategist. So the strategist is really no longer just someone who produces thinking. It's really increasingly becoming the interpreter, someone who can make maybe complex thoughts, maybe more legible, but across different worlds, across different dialects of what the C-suite versus the agency versus the brand manager might be asking for the board. So someone who can speak CFO without killing imagination, but can also speak creative without abandoning the commercial reality that, in fact, we do need to disrupt people and wake them up to pay attention to things, oftentimes to only slightly increase the odds, like water on rock, that we can reshape that rock, and that our propositions and our briefs can't really force anybody to buy anything. Our ads can't create demand. That's a myth. But we can back that up then when we can speak evidence without becoming too dogmatic, but also be intuitive enough without becoming like way too squishy and vague. So, I mean, in the end, strategy can't travel through an organization. It has to be operating at scale and something that more people are comfortable in.
So it's not about a project, but just about my own career. And this is one root problem that I have figured out, that when I say strategy, I've had to explain a lot of times what I do, why strategy is needed. Many people think they're already doing strategy. They are doing good strategy. When they are not doing anything, they are doing tactics or some activities. Recently, a friend asked that if brand is more than advertising or more than creative, then what is the difference between business and brand? And there is a difference, but also they are very closely related. We don't have to differentiate. But advertisers, one thing happens is they are taught that it's about creativity and it should be about following your passion. So they take brand in their own way, in a creative way, and then they try to distance themselves from the business. So then they say they are doing strategy, but they don't know what the word means. They create their own language. Then the business people, CEOs, founders, advertisers, they all have their different languages.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is one reason so many strategists probably feel exhausted right now, too. I mean, not just because they lack ideas, but they lack a common understanding of what it is they're supposed to be doing. And because they're trying to operate maybe inside of a system that often even lacks the fluency to properly recognize the value of anything that they're trying to produce. So maybe the future of strategy is not only about producing better thinking, but just a better understanding of each other and what it is that we're trying to do. Maybe it's about rebuilding the organizational fluency required to actually recognize good thinking in the first place. And so, like, even if they had the perfect definition of what a strategy is and what a strategist is, that would not actually substitute for just good taste and what could actually move the market, right? And so, like, once again, it's like everywhere I look, I just see like fluency kind of issues. But if there's a way that individual or even yourself could find comfort with the definition of what strategy is and what a strategist does, that actually also sets up for, then when I'm doing this, I'm doing a good job. When I'm not doing this, I'm not doing my job. Could give them a basic kind of red light, green light way to operate and be managed and have personal evaluations, compensation conversations, discussions, and things like that. Which, if you broke down to what, like, take an early career strategist, like, I'm making a lot of decks, doing competitive reviews and things like this. But, like, to what end? Means to what end? Let's talk about the outcomes that we're trying to get to. So I sympathize and empathize with the colleague that you referred to there in that sense. But, like, if within the own microculture of their organization, a set of words within the language being spoken locally that could define their work that nicely maps to, then this is when I'm doing it well versus when I'm really not doing it, then I think everybody would be well served. And if it's only focused on some kind of inside out alignment without actually meeting what the market needs, then that to me is where I would call into question whether it's creating a new problem. But I'd find a way to kind of balance between those two worlds. If in fact my job today is I'm going to spend my time to help this brand acquire a new customer, because over the next 2 years, most of their new customers are people that today have never heard of this brand. That's a lot of work to do. If over the next 2 years, 90% of your customers don't know who you are today, then what do you need to be doing today? Right? It's just like, when's the best day to plant a tree? Right? 30 years ago. Great shade. It's beautiful. You could sit underneath it, right? You could do a picnic next to it. But you can't go back in time. There's no time machine. So when is the next best time to plant a tree? Today, right? So do it today. Because if you're not better at acquiring more new customers today, then you might not have a future 2 years from now. And if too much of today is creating a deck about a super fan and how much they love the brand and how we're going to spend all this money to get them to download an app or do something to prove how much they love the brand or something like this, and that's how you're spending today and tomorrow and the next 6 weeks, all that time amounts up to how much time was actually being used to actually grow the brand, as opposed to, right? And then what's the mental model underneath that's driving that? It's great that there's a really successful, allegedly, campaign for McDonald's based on fan truths, and that discovering and doing really cool qualitative work and getting out there in consumer journals and doing very cool collabs with celebrities and fan truths. It's great that campaign has been successful for a brand that has 90% market penetration, suggesting that fan truths at that level of scale are practically universal and are essentially reach motivated. But if you then say, hey, it worked for McDonald's, I'm going to go take that same fan truths approach for this new startup niche brand that has 2% market share, and we're going to go do cool Widen like fan truth work for this startup. You don't understand the physics of the situation, right? Fan truths might work for a brand with 90% market penetration, but they probably aren't going to work for, and even then, if you look at the NBD of McDonald's, there's a great blog post by RET, as I like to call him, because I can't pronounce his last name, he's from Indonesia, who's a great senior marketing scientist at Ehrenberg-Bass. He can show you what the NBD looks like for many of the QSR brands. And what's cool is like 40% of McDonald's business still comes from light and frequent users. And so you wonder why they have to spend so much money and advertise all the time, because such a big chunk of their business comes from people who only buy them once. One thing of French fries a year, one milkshake a year. 40% of their business comes from someone who just rando buys, as if by random, one chicken McNugget, right? And so that's not going to work if you're a niche, small market share brand. Divesh.
I had a question. You mentioned in the what makes advertising profitable, and brand size was one of it. And now when I hear you about talking about McDonald's and then other brands, so availability, supply chain is the primary thing, being present where a consumer is going to find you or is going to need you or you are going to find a consumer is always going to be the primary lever for any brand to grow. And
But one of two,
creative.
but yes, a very important one, because it gets you two for the price of one. Yes.
Yeah. Because the most of younger brands get stuck into this acquiring customer versus lifetime value, because they spend a lot of money in acquiring a new customer and their availability is essentially lower than niche brands, as you talked about right now. So building mental availability for a brand like McDonald's and building mental availability for a niche brand, is there a different way? There is a different way to approach it. Like, how do you go about it primarily? Because right now, if advertising to be profitable, we need to keep acquiring new customers. But for a young brand or a brand which has a limited amount of kitty to spend money on, it becomes a catch-22 situation.
Exactly. To be a small brand. And so there's nothing I can say to make it sound easier to be a small brand, but doesn't change the conditions necessary to, over time, increase the odds of becoming a big brand. And every big brand started off as a small brand. And so again, the boundary conditions for becoming bigger are fairly well known now. But so much of what we try and do avoids those things, or tries to hack around them in ways that perhaps aren't going to be sustainable. But there are ways to prioritize the choices that you're making that then over time, cumulatively, in an unduplicated way, allow you to reach more new customers, as opposed to over pivoting into the seductive misunderstanding that once you have a customer, do everything to hang on to them with all of your budget, because that's all you can afford to do. So it's bringing balance to that. But again, the same things that helped a small brand become a big brand are the same conditions that make it hard for any small brand to grow. And yes, there is an advantage of a big brand once you have become the big brand, but there is no guarantee that you will stay the big brand. And again, those same boundary conditions will still exist, and you still have to work very, very hard to continue to get someone to go from none to one over time, whatever your purchase cycle might be. It's just a different way to prioritize. But to your point, the clue is in physical availability or purchase availability, because wherever your brand is already easy to find, that's where any dollars you have is where you should be spending your mental availability. Don't go build mental availability where your brand is naturally harder to find. So in other words, big brands become big because they're easier to buy, and small brands stay small when they're harder to buy. And so do as much as you can, not just with your 1P communications, but across all 4Ps, to remove friction, how can your price make your brand easier to buy? How can your distribution, your place, how can the design of the product, how can all these things help it be easier to buy? And when you've got those 3Ps that are doing the best that they can to orchestrate your brand being easier to buy, then your 4th P, right? You can really start to invest and scale mental availability. What's the entry point you're going after? So concepts like category entry points and just understanding the path, or the physical availability or geographic constraints of where it is that you might be selling can alone be great, ways to focus your spend and your efforts long before you start looking at archetypes or demography or other segmenty kinds of things. Simply knowing who a category rejector is, that's a great way to profile. Knowing who's in market, who's out of market, being able to understand that. These are great ways to help prioritize. But those are all the things I would stack up for a small brand first before I'd go chase some other things that we typically would focus in on that perhaps might align a room, but the market would be wouldn't give the market what it needs.
Just to what you said, appreciate how you put it. And whenever I talk to you, I understand that the consumer insight for creative, it is important, but there is 90 things before it that is much more important, that needs to exist before we reach to that place. Unfortunately, the 10% is given more focus than the 90% in most cases when it goes to the decks.
We're often drawn to the things that romantically interest us, whether they're commercially significant or not. Again, feel the best strategists will need to be bilingual in both schools of thought. I mean, to that point, we can't just romance about what's going on inside of the house, whether it be our agency or the client side. Like, we need to be open to all these light, infrequent people who could care less about our brand, don't ever want to think about our category. Like, what's the hidden life of the person who barely ever wants to think about our brand? And like, how do we understand where they are? Because when you over pivot on one of these two camps, one camp might want absolute certainty about measurement, economics, optimization, predictability. But then you've got another camp that's just all about culture, and emotion and semiotics and humanities and storytelling and Joseph Campbell and archetypes and so being the person who can interpret between the two those worlds, I mean, both contain useful truths, but both become super dangerous when they're treated as total explanations, right? And so again, it's trying to find a way to balance that space in between. Evidence without interpretation can often really sound like dogma, whereas interpretation without evidence is like psychic readings. So the future strategist needs to become, I think, like really multilingual. Right now, it's kind of bilingual in the sense you've got market-based asset theory, which is evidence-based marketing inclined. And it's not to say that there might be additional dialects of that as that continues to grow and become more mentally and physically available. But then for a long time, we've got this intuitive side. We've got this Kotler and Keller world that it's very comforting to us that like the way we made great friends in high school when we showed up at the cafeteria wearing the right music group or band t-shirt, and all of a sudden the table that wouldn't have otherwise let us sit down and have lunch with them says, oh man, they're into that. Like, wow, that worked for you building friends early on in your life, but is that really the same recipe that's going to work at market scale for millions of people with the brand or category that you're again? It's very seductive. It's very seductive, but in fact, there's something in between. It's the strategist of the future who's someone who could pick one school and really be able to shift halfway and kind of argue the other side. It's someone who can move between the schools without kind of really losing the humanity of how people feel when they feel confronted with outsider information, but also can help be that person to help kind of translate in between. And so that's, I think, a great place to be, because these schools aren't going anywhere. I mean, again, it's like over the next 5 to 10 years, evidence-based marketing will continue to elevate. But I think if we look out to at least 2030, so let's look out for another 4 years or so, it looks less like a department and maybe more like some kind of connective tissue. And this is just something spidey senses, I think, are suspecting, because it's going to be less siloed. It's going to be way less linear, which I think is a great thing. It's going to be less defined by very clear garden walls and boundaries. And I think it's going to be way more connective. The old model was often a linear relay race, right? Client asks for a project and one function handles that. Then research comes in, and then strategy writes the brief. And then meanwhile, the deadline hasn't changed. And then creative makes the campaign. And then media hasn't woken up to anything until there's something to make. And maybe even then they're not even interested in what the creative is, but then they distribute it. And then a client approves something and then everybody moves on. But really the modern business environment is way too interconnected and unstable for these clean sequences to continue to happen. So now strategy is just leaks everywhere, in good ways, into product, into CX, into creator influencer systems, which are now reach primacy tools for a lot of modern brands. It now seeps into AI workflows, into organizational change, into retail pricing, internal politics, and yes, into culture itself. So this means that strategist really is increasingly becoming more of this connective tissue, or this glue between the shards of mosaic that pull this quilt together. I'm mixing my metaphors right now, but Inside of complex systems, how can we be more of that glue? Part analyst, part translator, part curator, part facilitator, part pattern recognizer, but also part organizational diplomat. I mean, you don't have to be the loudest voice in the room, but often the person really helping these different worlds understand each other well enough to actually move the market, if the market can be moved in the moment. And I think a lot of strategists today are not anxious because they fear change. They're anxious because they're being asked to constantly reinvent themselves while still proving their legitimacy. If you go back to what Nikunj was talking about, and just the definition of what a strategist is. So maybe the future challenge is not simply producing quote unquote smarter strategists, whatever that might be, but it's building environments and setting conditions where strategic thinking can actually survive long enough to matter. That's going to take a village. The one prescription I'll put on all of this, and just a final thought to open it up for whoever's left to have some more open conversation, is, again, it's like learn to unlearn, right? It's great Richard Feynman, who continues to be like one of my heroes to this day, may rest in peace, really opened me up to this earlier in my university teaching or learning, that it's really a way of life. It's the Feynman technique. The best way to learn is to teach. So you read and research where your gaps are, teach, listen to the questions being asked, realize, oh my gosh, I don't know this, I don't know that, and learn into those gaps, and then teach into those gaps. And then you'll keep finding gaps and gaps and gaps, and then assess and iterate over time. You will expand both your depth of both horizontal, broad-based knowledge, as well as vertically go deep enough into a number of topics. And at a certain point, you start to see and sense how they all start to interconnect. So simply put, some of the best advice I love to give whenever I end any presentation anywhere in the world, virtually or in real life, is teach. We need more teachers. We need more co-learners. We need more people helping. Yes, I feel the pitch room should become a classroom on occasion, because oftentimes it's our clients who you need to know the most. You just need to find suitable and appropriate ways underneath the surface to help them learn along the way. These things don't have to be so jarring. They don't have to be so confrontational. At what point are you committing malpractice? I mean, of some clients, it reminds me of like when you realize you've got a heroin addict and it's really hard to come off of heroin. So you're going to say, okay, I'm not going to abandon you. I'm going to make certain you've got clean syringes, and I've got an EMT standing nearby with some Narcan, so that if you OD, we're there to take care of you. And sometimes the things that clients want to do are equivalent to this. So do you abandon them? Or do you work with them and to help them rehabilitate and set the conditions for them to get better at what they're doing, knowing that there's a lot maybe they don't know? And so, I mean, in the end, I mean, that's the future of strategy, I think, is the rise of just being this multilingual strategist and just having this shared fluency and finding ways to really succeed in the messy middle, because it's not going to get any cleaner. It's only going to get messier. And thus, you got to prepare, got to be ready for that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so if anybody wants to reflect on any of that, or if I'm always curious to hear what was most confronting. Some of it you probably, I mean, for those of you who've been following brandLingual or myself or Bob, our content, you can see why we have such a great passion for what we're doing together, because it does exist with us personally and individually, but it's also something I'm constantly managing and minding and understanding here at TRG with my own client work, with my own work at Miami Ad School. So I'm literally in it every day. It's something I am swimming in now nonstop. And so it's when you're someone living a professional and personal life like I am, I got 50 words for some of these things because they're so important and the nuances are important. But having that shared fluency and opening up and being open to understanding how all these things interconnect and how they might be different from how I was once first taught, I think is just a great way to be. It's not for everyone, but I think the more teachers and learners and co-learners we can have out in the world, increases the odds that, in fact, more high quality marketing will be done across all 4 Ps and not just seen as a 1P magic insight framework, creative brief, Lollapalooza. Yeah, that can be fun. I did a lot of that in my career, but it's a small drop in what all needs to be done and all needs to come together.
Yes, I'm on the line.
Amazing.
Thank you.
Is Iris with you?
When I get back. She is in fact with me. It's just that you're in my airplanes at the moment.
Understood. Most important slide would probably be this.
Yeah. Now just wait. Yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
If you can hear Iris
Oh.
right now, that's what the real future of strategy sounds like. It's Iris and with very smart people like Samantha being the people raising them up.
Good.
Oh. Thanks, me.
Yeah. Thank you for joining us again. It was so great to have you in Rob's session.
No worries. She really enjoyed it last time. I think she was expecting to see Rob today, but she was a little bit disappointed.
I wish we could have Rob on all these calls, but Rob is a very busy guy. And so the fact that we get Rob out every couple of months, I think is great. But yeah, I'm with Iris on that point. Okay, cool. That's all I have. I'm going to stop the share now and just to kind of see who's left. And if anyone wants to continue to talk, I'd love to reflect or talk about anything else you want to talk about.
This was really cool. Thank you, Chris. I can't really talk much because I got some stuff to do over here. Really cool stuff. Thank you. And yeah, it's funny how like a lot of this stuff, I think about what the job means and what other people think it means. And I remember talking to a client once, and I was going over something, and he was like, "How do you?" Sorry, I was like, he said something about like, "How do you know this? How do you know this without having data?" And I was like, at the end of the day, like that's the magic. That's why I'm here. That's why you hired me, is because I get to have these intuitions, basically. I get to have this insight. I can't exactly tell you how, I know this, but it created this sort of friction point. Like he didn't like that answer because as a marketer, like it was all about data. But then the whole point of like hiring people like me and like us is to kind of get that aha moment that you might be lacking. And again, I guess that question that I posed is like, why does no one ask that question of a CEO whenever they're like, hey, you know what? I think the market is going here. Let's just like create a new product or whatever. And like everyone's like, yeah, okay. Why isn't that questioned? And maybe it's my ego, but I always thought that like what strategists were at the end of the day, like if you're a full stack strategist and you try to be one and you're trying to kind of like, you are essentially like a mini CEO for hire, because like you have this wide angle view. You also like have seen the data. You also know the customer, you know the product, you're thinking about like the brand, you're thinking about the company. And so like, yeah, it's a very strange way to always have to defend what you're there for. And I feel like that's just been the thing in strategy ever since I started. Like I remember asking someone like, what is strategy? And they're like, well, it depends who you ask.
Yeah. How long is a piece of string, right?
Yeah. But like, and when I think about it, it does make sense in that way. But again, I have to ramble for like 5 minutes in order to express that. Like, it's not easy. And I've always been thinking like, how do you get that point across? Like,
Yeah. There's data-driven, data-based, and evidence-based. There's also a great episode of Sleeping Barber podcast where they interview Dr. Ella Ward, who makes the same point, which is where I'm stealing this from, where data-driven is when you go to the doctor and they take your blood and say, oh, you've got high cholesterol, right? And so in other words, it's data-driven that you've got high cholesterol. Evidence-based is when they say, well, based on your age and your other conditions and co-contributing factors, this is the prescription for you, right? And there's lots of different remedies for high cholesterol, but based on all the other things that we know, this is the prescription for you. And that's evidence-based, based on longitudinal trials of lots of different people. Data says you got high cholesterol, but it doesn't mean that every single patient is treated the same way based on what the data says. And an evidence-based understanding, you then understand that there's a particular prescription given the situation that you're in. And I think that's the difference here, is when someone is only looking at a data dashboard and they don't actually, that's not evidence-based. It's like, what do you mean it's not evidence-based? I've got the data. The data is the evidence. And I think I agree with Sebastian when he said it, that often that misunderstanding. Well, of course I've got the evidence. Look at my dashboard. I'm looking at ROAS. I'm looking at my MROI. I'm looking at my click-through rates and my likes and my engagement things. And it's like, these are a lot of vanity metrics that often don't amount to click-through rates, there's 30 years of evidence suggests that they have no impact on commercial outcome. But like, again, our industry, if not well-trained and not learned on these things, it's it's the number I got to prove to make somebody happy. And that's a different incentive structure. So competing incentive structures mixed with a misunderstanding of what data and evidence is create conditions for what you're talking about, right? Where you're constantly then in a defensive posture, trying to suggest what's going to work, what's not going to work. But if you can be that person fluent in between those worlds and help that person translate, I know you said this, but did you really mean that? Or I like how you're looking at it this way, but you realize that's happening not because of this shiny object, but it's really happening because of this thing underneath the surface. And then in which case, there's no guarantees there, but you're trying to provide some counterfactuals, you're trying to bring in some actual evidence that shows that the situation that you're in is not exotic. And too many clients suffer from eternal uniqueness, where they think that like, oh, my business is so different and my culture is so different and my CEO is so different and the board is so different, my product's so different. They're so obsessed with differentiation when really the conditions that they have are just like any other brand. And the situation that they're in, there's been a million other brands in that same situation a million times before. So how did they get out of it, right? And if you don't have access to those law-like patterns or have an understanding of the moves to make, like a playbook, then it's very often that you can just stay inside of one person's sort of myopic, what they feel to be data-driven reality, when in fact there's a very clear pattern. You see this with a lot of startups that often go out of business within the first 3 years because of something called the performance plateau. And it's a very clear data signature you see when you're misappropriating the balance between, let's call it your long and short, or as EBI would call it, between your mental and your physical availability. When those things are imbalanced, that usually at about 2.8 to kind of 3.2 years or something like this, a brand flattens out and suddenly its cost per acquisition goes up and up and up and up, and then they run out of money and then they go out of business because they weren't investing in more long-lasting, call it brand building, or more kind of memory first work that made certain that a future buyer was going to have a higher likelihood of choosing because you reached them while they were out of market, which is where most people are. It's then being able to put the evidence back in front of them and show them the moves that they can make to break those very clear patterns that are observable if you're looking at market data. And just like a good doctor might suggest, they are looking at your symptoms and conditions. We need to do this. As opposed to, no. It's like, if it worked for them, this can't work for me because I'm so unique and different. We have to have our own unique and different way to do it. And that's often not the case. So yeah, I think it's having the fluency in those models to be able to, and then have a good relationship with that person, and again have a mission set.
And like, but for me, the issue, I guess, because like what you talked about is, okay, well, that's why we do research. That's why we do market research. That's why we do case studies. But I feel like the time to prove any of that has gotten so crunched because it takes good time. It takes like real time to do that in order to be able to show that. And I guess maybe like with AI, that's kind of like the new shortcuts. Like you can kind of pull sort of a market study kind of quickly, or hopefully, like it's not hallucinated. But like, yeah, all like the evidence to bring, it takes time to procure. And so that to me, like everything is asked for now. So like, how do you be like, well, okay, first we need to do like a little bit of research, like that might take a week or whatever it is. Like that, it never seems to fly well.
Measure twice, cut once. If there's a way to kind of play it back, I know the business that you're in, right? And if there's an analogy that could work as to how to make a good cup of coffee or how to roast a bean or something like, because there's a very measured, replicable commercial process that they employ to do things right behind the scenes to expand their brand. And that same kind of discipline and rubric can be practiced on the marketing side. So it's not like it's an entirely different way to work. It might be actually more similar to how just because of familiarity bias, the back end of their business is more familiar to them. And the front end of the business, the marketing side, is less familiar to them, but maybe some of the same dynamics play.
No. What I wanted to say is that if we get back to these data versus evidence conundrum, we'll see that a very common misconception is that adding more data will improve the decision-making process, which
Right.
is very often not true, because data is something that is marginally adding and not radically changing it. So if you take a look at a small research and if a panel of 100 persons, or if you have a panel of 1,000 persons, depending on what you want to pan out, you'll probably not need to pay for 900 more people to take part in it to make a better decision. And that's something that is very often not understood. And the same thing is that data is not equal to information, which was brilliantly described today by Harrison in his podcast, if you attended. Again, the very important thing, which is often unforeseen and unrecognized both by strategists and by business people, is that it all drops back to decision making. And if you add more entities without making a better decision, you're probably wasting resources. And if we get back to the question, I've stopped rambling. So the question is, how can we help you answer these questions? I mean, there are 5 observations and 5 questions. How can we help you with finding the proper answers to them?
What you speak of is very real, because it's the cliched, like, statistics and numbers and things can often be perceived as like a window into an objective understanding, but yet the interpretation and the manipulation of all those things can be used in all sorts of interesting ways. And for every number, someone says, well, look at this number, and think, well, yeah, but look at this number and look at this number. And all of a sudden, like you said, you've got all this arguments, and then it turns into who's better at assassinating the methodology and questioning the methodology. How do you clean that up? If you're into one of these like data mudslinging matches, how do you intervene? How can you set conditions on the front end to where it's kind of like, the best solution is prevention? How can you set hygiene or conditions on the front end to where you're lowering the odds to be in one of these mudslinging matches, particularly as it relates to, say, like a company that might have a strong loyalty program or have some metrics around how they can prove that a loyalty program is making certain customers more profitable. There's a lot of data massaging and torturing of the data that can paint pictures that make it seem as if something's happening. And then it's like magic mirror. And then you look at it from the other perspective, and you actually see what the amount of money that's going into making this happen. And it's not offsetting, the profit that's being gained, and that these aren't fixed segments, et cetera, et cetera. But back to your question, like, how do you, this to me this is why this is called a practice. It's like you have to keep doing this with different clients in different categories and different conditions. You start to see enough of the variation. But I'm convinced now that prevention is the best solution. But when you get into these moments where you have to kind of push people apart or intervene, you often need a seemingly objective, neutral third party mediator to do this. You need someone without commercial or ego interest in the moment to provide some kind of oxygen or a chance to reflect. It's not that different from in sci-fi movies where you'll see it begins on like a planet, and you've got these 2 warring factions. And then all of a sudden this like alien invader comes in that wants them both dead. And so then they have to come together and join forces to fight this outside thing. And it's like that same kind of shift in dynamic often has to happen in order to get people to see like-minded again. It's probably a sort of not meaning to be a facetious example, but those kinds of dynamic shifts where you've got an objective third party that is helping you see quote unquote market reality that perhaps at that given moment is not. You've got 2 sides claiming to be showing market reality, right? But they both have their own vested interests. And so how do you bring in someone who can show you market reality without a vested interest? And then the question is, well, who brought them in? Because then it's like, okay, well, because so-and-so brought them in, they brought them in because of this. And that to me is potentially a way out. I don't think there's a silver bullet in these situations, but the fact that there isn't enough collaboration between academia and the marketing world. And I feel like that's often where you can find it's the closest place to get to some kind of seemingly more objective, less commercially motivated truth. And there are wonderful groups and departments and institutes at universities around the world that could potentially be that are always looking for ways to reach out and get more practical, real world access to clients. And I think that's often an underutilized move to be made because it's hard to separate the ego from the data, from the motivation when you get into political organizations. And so when you've got evidence to suggest that, well, that might not work under these conditions, it's like, what do you mean? It's like, what do you mean? That's my dance move. That's my signature move. That's how I play the game. That's how I spike the ball. That's my moonwalk. And it's when someone's personal or professional identity feels like it's under threat, where you see people clam up, and it's how do you then try and keep it objective? How do you keep it away from those more egocentric decisions? And that's, if we can find a replicable way to solve for that, I think that would be a great service. I'd like to think there's a hint in how we could, in the marketing world, be better bridges to academia. But even just saying that makes some people cringe. Like for some reason, like academia is a bad word, or particularly in the US right now, where it's just like any kind of intellectualism is considered like threatening, because you should just be like going with your gut and just making things up and like, don't take that vaccine, don't do this. What do they know? What do the experts know? And just go with your own like tribal jingoistic kind of thing, which I know is part of human tribal behavior. But yeah, I mean, you can have a better understanding of how things work and you get trained, you can be better. And I think that's the thing that we shouldn't shut down, and we need to be open to. It's like, my two beautiful adult daughters would not have survived their birth without science. So it's like you can have a deeper understanding of how things work and you can get better outcomes. And why is that okay over here but not okay over here? That's what I don't always get. It's like I will probably still have my adult teeth late into my life. Thank you, science. But so why can't I also realize that banner ads all the time, and over investing in them isn't going to grow my brand? Thank you, science. But how's it different? So I feel like we're on the same side on that. And I don't really, it's like, I have some ways in that I would be comfortable like doing, but again, it's like your mileage might vary given the client relationship or different things. So hopefully I've, the spirit of the law answered your question, but maybe not to the letter of the law that I've got a perfect perspective.
Samantha goes next.
Is it Samantha or Iris?
This is Samantha, sir. Sorry, I'm sure she has stuff to say, but I had basically it's one long question that's broken into two. I've heard all the stuff that you said about it and how it like all just going to become more generalist, and that's how we strengthen strategy in general. But I wanted to ask, how do we destigmatize the use of intuition in driving certain things? I'm sure a lot of famous campaigns have come from someone's intuition, especially with Cadbury's and probably a host of different ones where they just last minute change something that's basically revolutionized what we know to be the ad industry. So how, one, do we destigmatize it? And for two, since science is still ongoing and expanding as we know it in real time, and what we know of science now is that there's a lot of stuff that we used to once think of as more holistic, and it's now coming into a space where it's more of an accepted science, which is really interesting. Like, there's a lot of stuff that we wouldn't really put together until just now. So how do we then tie that back to intuition and how we frame that to make it seem like just as valuable? Because that's basically our USP, basically our lived experience.
Yeah, I really love that perspective because, well, a couple of things. Answer this backwards. It's like, like a good scientist can't wait to be wrong, right? Like they love to kind of find things that we think work this way and then it works the other way. And so it's like, it's that ongoing process of, okay, and they're constantly trying to test it under different conditions to see, is it the observer or the practitioner that is actually biasing and the outcomes? And so in many ways, they love to find that someone's wrong, and they also kind of love to be wrong because it means there's more things to kind of learn and grow. And so I think it is everything that we're talking about is still an ongoing process, a journey. And so much of it is starting to kind of like map together. And so we need to keep an eye on that. And so, and be open to that and not shut our thinking down as such that we don't leave room for like what like is called punk planning. Right. And I think like if you go back to like some of the best, I don't know, just punk artists in general, it's like they know so well the canon and the foundation of what is the core that then knowingly subvert it, right? Like they know it so well that if they want to hack it or if they want to like subvert it, they know how to do that in a way that matters. It's not like they just are making things up out of the blue. It's like they're disrupting something, knowing really well what the construct is. And so I think room for intuition and innovation and seemingly unexplainable decisions that are getting to outcomes, we should still feel free to express and get excited about in our creative process, but build them on top of the conditions of what we know are the boundaries for something to work, right? So it's like punk planning is best and when it's subverting something very knowingly, as opposed to just kind of coming in out of the blue as if like, I've got a random idea and like, look at this. In fact, so much of this stuff, Samantha, is about understanding the plumbing. But once you've got the plumbing set, then we can spend all day long on like picking out the drapes and the thread count and the paint on the walls. And like we can interior decorate and be really, really distinctive and interesting. But like if we've got the plumbing set, like now we've got all this freedom to be creative. And so to me, there will always be a stigma both on science as well as intuition, depending on what camp you are personally identifying with. Some of my colleagues who are actual scientists still appreciate romantic thoughts and art and expression, but they also understand like the conditions in which those things can be like more or less effective, but it doesn't stop them from being creative. And then there can also be people who are, and I have the privilege of working with some who are very, very creative and nonlinear in their thinking and are great craftspeople, but also don't want to realize that they have a responsibility and accountability to the money that they're spending and the budgets that they have stewardship over. It's having that mutual respect that is often a rare thing to find because we can be so tribal in a binary way where things always have to be this way or that way, and there's no room for the gray in between. And so I think the destigmatizing of intuitive work is best done when we understand that for a very long time, without knowing so many things we know now, successful work was being created because of a natural human instinct to want to, to show up and be different and to break out and to be competitive or whatever it might be. But in those instances where real things were happening that were successful, that there were actual conditions that were happening underneath the surface that those people just happened to be benefiting from. And those things are still observable and repeatable and understandable. And when you put those two things together, it's like alchemy. You bring your creative, powerful, magical intuition, however you want to put it, and then you couple that with the conditions for how things work. And now it can seem like you're spinning gold. And there's a number of agencies and a number of practitioners, a number of brand marketers who have had successful hits again and again and again. There's a CMO that works here in town now, George Felix, who has been a part of just some really amazing campaigns. And he's one of the few CMOs that has actually been elevated into a CEO role, which you don't see very often. And so he was behind the Old Spice, The Man You Wish Your Man Could Be, and some of the great Tinder work. He brought the Colonel back to KFC. He's helped rehabilitate Chili's, a casual dining brand in the US that was pretty much considered dead until he and Mischief and some other people have gotten behind the work. And, he's one of these people that has a intuition about him and knows well enough to partner with the right people and the right crew to to pull this to seemingly repeatably create success, right? Increase the odds of success. There's never a guarantee. But I think is a really wonderful balance of bringing in an intuition into the mix, but respecting the boundaries of what can and can't work. Because he's never had an infinite budget. And there's never been a guarantee for anything that he's touched to ever work. Yeah, I mean, I think destigmatizing both science and intuition is the way to be, because then you're bringing balance. If one has to be stigmatized to destigmatize the other, we're fucked. Or sorry, I know Iris is listening. We are losing, right? For one side to win, the other side has to lose. I mean, that's lazy thinking, which is common for a lot of humans, because again, we don't want to think. It's like we want to go with what we know and don't want to expend the energy to do it. But I think that's where some system thinking is actually worthy of engaging in. Because once you've done system 2 enough and you find something that works for you, that becomes system 1. It go with the flow. And now your intuition is actually intuitively, effortlessly bringing some evidence-based principles into your practice.
Thank you so much. That's given me a lot to think about, especially at a more junior stage than some of you guys. So it's really good, because at least I know some examples of when it's been able to happen more consistently. Because at the moment, especially when people are doubting why strategy is kind of needed on a larger scale, especially when digital marketing and anything marketing is usually caught first in times of recession, it's kind of refreshing to understand that the people that made such a big impact has probably paved the way for us to combine both in a more convincing and compelling way. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Always great to have you on the call. Look to see you next time.
Definitely.
Thanks. Nikunj, I've got 8 minutes and I have to go to my next meeting, but I'm happy to hang on for the next 8 minutes.
I have a lot of thoughts from this conversation, so trying to put it all together.
I'll take that as a compliment.
So intuition, I have a different opinion of that. Intuition is trained patterns. So Warren Buffett, it was written in the book that from the childhood, he read so much that he had formed an intuition. He had trained it, the gut feeling or the reaction. And in advertising, we often have that intuition that we have observed humans or studied the theories. But there is also the creativity part where we have to break away from the pattern. That is from Edward de Bono. That break away from the set patterns. So there is that requirement. Also, strategy is, I forget the name of that HBR professor who said strategy is not planning.
Yeah,
so strategies.
Roger Martin.
Yeah, Roger Martin. So strategies out there, the other competitors, the people, politics, everything is changing. Technology is changing. So we never know what will work, but it's a gamble. We can guess our best. And in the data or the evidence, and CEOs or whoever, they are looking for control from strategy. There is one strategist on LinkedIn, Alex Emmett Smith. He's not from the advertising world at all.
Yeah, familiar with him.
So he says strategy increases risk. Reducing risk is looking for control, and that makes everything safer. Advertising becomes safer, it becomes same, acceptable. But strategy is increasing risk, so others can't do it. But if it works for us, then it's great. And then I had written one comment that I learned, I think, from Mark Bullard, that always ask who's gaining from something. So if they're looking for evidence or data, or they're questioning something, the big problem that not anything intellectualism or theory, science, that is bad. So the people who are gaining from it are the people who are not studying. They're the people who don't want to do the work. So this very famous line that anyone can do marketing, or marketing is only practical. You learn it by doing. All this is, they don't want to do the work. They don't want to do the hard work before starting it. And that serves them, but then it creates mistrust in the industry. And then all these people start questioning us. And then they look for data and evidence because they feel unsafe. They feel this is risky. So they intuitively knew how to do it. And with more data, we are forgetting what to do. It's
Yeah.
about the science thing. So this friend of Richard Feynman, he's an artist, and he says that I, as an artist, can see how beautiful this flower is, but you, as a scientist, take this apart and it becomes a dull thing. And he says that, I'm paraphrasing, that everyone can appreciate the aesthetic beauty, and even Richard Feynman can. But the other dimensions, which is the atoms, the color evolves to attract the insects, and the geometry, that is not something the artist can, but the scientist can appreciate. So it
Yeah.
goes deeper.
I love that. Yeah. I mean, there's beauty in the minutia. It's like beauty is in the eye of the beholder, right? And something that might be considered plainly or superficially aesthetically pleasing or beautiful to many people might also be offensive to the few. And something beautiful or aesthetically pleasing to the few might be offensive to the many. And so much of this gets complicated because of the sheer subjectivity of it all. But it's the fact that both groups have shared fascination in the same thing, but coming in from different angles, is the power of the flower in the first place. The fact that the flower can be celebrated and revered at two different levels, that the microscopic and the macroscopic, is part of what makes a flower so winning in a way. Are there some things that no one appreciates at either level? Are there some things that only the scientist appreciates that the layman does not, and vice versa? Yes, but it's those things that bring the gaze of both parties essentially accomplishing larger reach that are probably more celebrated. So yeah, I think there's an interesting little meta understanding of what you just talked about that I really kind of quite dig. It's yeah.
This also reminds me that we have talked about it a few times, the Philip Horvath's article about limits of distinction, that when we don't have the vocabulary, we can't understand and appreciate things.
Yeah, or it's harder to share an appreciation of those things.
So sometimes this happens that I'll cry at some movie, not because the story is good, but because the direction or the scene composition or voice acting or animation, if it's animated, something like that. So it's because I have learned this over time and now I appreciate the hard work behind it.
Yeah, as if by random, seemingly people at individual levels have lots of different thoughts and feelings about any one thing based on that alone. But at the real question becomes, in marketing, is at scale, which of those hold at market scale? So you could watch a new film and really dislike the style of animation, and someone else next to you, like you're saying, could really enjoy it because they know how much effort goes into stop motion animation, or that it was practically done and it wasn't done using CG. And just because of the sheer human effort endeavor to put into that, there's respect at that level. But it's based on your own individual understanding. And so at what point there's enough people that feel commonly about that thing, that's when it becomes marketing. At those smaller numbers is when we're at the level of what I'd call sales, or just personal subjective experience. Those things are so much more emotionally resonant and real to us that our bias is then to use those things to inform our strategy work, because it feels good and it feels very affirming. But then that's when we've committed the cardinal sin as a strategist, is that we look in the mirror and we see the customer, when 99.99% of the time they are not us. But it's then having that appreciation that there can be a broad range of people's opinions towards something at an individual level. But the job of a marketer is not to understand how one person feels about something. It's just how a million people feel about something. And in many instances, you find that they don't feel much about it at all until they need it. And so then that becomes the moment that you really need to focus on. And that can be confronting to some strategists because they would rather do what feels right to them. But that's not the job. So then, is that a way to put a more practical definition around what good or bad strategy is if you've got a colleague who's struggling with the work I need to be doing or whether I'm a good or bad strategist? And it's the one who's constantly coming up with a reason for why I would buy this that is doing the bad work, as opposed to how would 1 million people buy this thing more often? And that's the good work. So we have to understand it at the macro level, and we have to understand it at the micro level. But a lot of the micro work, to me, is understanding our team members, our colleagues, our clients, and our politics, and bridging that to the macro understanding, which is reconciling the fact that this brand will be a success if more people who are completely unlike us buy this thing over time. And then again, we're back to being the interpreter, being the bridge, being the cellular structure that's trying to hold the thing together at macro and micro, for both in market and out of market, for both mental and physical availability. So it's always like we're trying to bridge between these binary constructs for the 95 and for the 5.
Balance of investment.
Yeah. Investment in time, investment in energy, investment in...
If there is some investment in physical, then there has to be the relevant investment in mental.
Yes. Yeah. And it goes back to something Devesh said earlier about the distribution piece. It's like, the benefit of distribution or being on the right shelves is it gets you 2 things for the price of 1. Is it gets you some mental availability along with your physical availability. And it doesn't work in the opposite direction. So when you're investing in mental availability, that doesn't do anything for physical availability. But like if you have a store on the proper intersection with a sign, and that's great trade area, lots of traffic in that area, and everyone's seeing your sign and realize your store's there, you're getting 2 for the price of 1. So the dollars going into that real estate investment might actually be working harder than the dollars going into a banner ad in a digital media buy. For a brand that's overspending on PMAX or performance media, you might argue you're not even advertising, right? You're not even marketing, because you're not setting conditions that for in the future, someone is going to have a higher likelihood of choosing your brand. You're only focusing on someone who's ready to buy today. And that's sales. And that's like having an unlocked door in the front of your store. So like having an unlocked door in the front of your store is going to help that store sell things. Turn all your advertising off. And what you'll watch is that people will continue to buy, and then it'll start to decline very gradually over time. But lock your front door of your store and you've shut sales off immediately. So it's like when you shut off physical availability, that like has a very harsh, sharp impact in the numbers. Turn your advertising off and you'll watch it slowly decay. All the more evidence that it's really just about memory building. It's literally just all about ad stock and decay over time. And so that to me is a great proof point particularly for a retail client. Take your product off all the shelves, lock the door, sales turns off like a flashlight, like a light switch. Turn off your advertising, watch it continue, right? Because most of your advertising was not about getting someone to buy today. It was increasing the odds that someone is going to buy next week or next month or next quarter. I think that's proven in these suppression tests and these turning advertising off tests. But shut off your physical availability and it's instant. So yeah, physical availability is about selling today. Mental availability is about selling next week, next quarter, next year. So when you confuse those 2 things, you can see how everything starts to get messy. Turn off your advertising and watch, people are still buying. Why? Because the people seeing the advertising aren't ready to buy today. 95% of them are going to buy next week or next month or next quarter. So, I mean, that can be a very stark way to convince a client of what's going on. But they don't have to do it with their own data. This has been done already. These tests have already been done and published. All this information exists and they're no different. It's when they fall back into their eternal uniqueness. Well, I need to do it with my own data. I need to do this with my own store and see what happens.
On that, there is a paradox. Clients will say that my competitor or my neighbor is doing something. They're running Google ads, so I want to run Google ads. But when it's come to data, they want to have their own.
I tell this joke occasionally in classes. There's like, it's like when your neighbor wins the lottery, you're like, oh my God, my neighbor won the lottery. Like, we live on the same street. Like, suddenly you feel like you can win the lottery. And then it's like okay, so like, what kind of car do they drive? How often do they cut their grass? When do they check their mail? Like, if I just like map those same behaviors, I could win the lottery too, because it's your neighbor. And, you see this with like Liquid Death or something. Like, look what Liquid Death did. That's so cool. We just need to be like Liquid Death. And it's like, it's not how it works. But yeah, it's like being very picky choosy with what the rules are. And so unfortunately I have to go, but I do enjoy spending time hanging out with everybody and asking these questions. It's so good to see you again, Devesh. It's been years. We need to connect.
Yes, yes,
Thank you. Cheers.